Malcolm stood quietly in the center of the sleek, modern gallery, the bright white walls glaring down at him as if they, too, were judging him. His hand shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of years spent creating these pieces, bold, emotional works that captured his struggles, his triumphs, and his journey. He had spent countless hours pouring himself into his art, but to Mr. Stevens, none of it seemed to matter. The gallery owner, dressed in a sharp-tailored suit and polished shoes, glanced briefly at Malcolm's work with a look of disdain. "This is, well, different," Mr. Stevens remarked with a hint of mockery in his voice, his eyebrows raised in a silent challenge to the very idea of abstract art. Malcolm's latest series was a blend of chaotic brushstrokes, vibrant hues, and stark contrasts. Each canvas told a story, stories of hardship, resilience, and beauty. But to Mr. Stevens, it was nothing more than a collection of colors and shapes that lacked the commercial appeal he craved. "You see," Mr. Stevens continued, pacing around the room as if in deep thought, "there's just not a market for this kind of work. You need something more refined, something that speaks to the collectors. These," he gestured dismissively toward the canvases, "they're too wild, too untamed." His lips curled into a brief, condescending smile. Malcolm's chest tightened, but he held his ground. He had faced rejection before, but something about this moment felt different. Mr. Stevens was making assumptions, judging the work, without even understanding it. Malcolm could feel the sting of each word, but he refused to let it show. "I know what I'm offering," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "These are pieces of me. You may not understand them now, but they speak to those who know art." But Mr. Stevens was already moving on. He didn't have time to entertain what he saw as a frivolous attempt at artistic expression. "Look, I'll be honest with you," he said, his tone sharp. "I don't think this will sell, and I don't want to waste your time or mine. Maybe you should look elsewhere." The dismissal was final. Malcolm stood in silence as Mr. Stevens turned his back on him, already walking away to inspect another set of paintings from an established, more marketable artist. Malcolm gathered his things, a quiet storm building inside him. He had been dismissed, belittled, and brushed aside. But deep down, he knew he was not finished. This was just the beginning. His art was worth more than just approval from a single gallery owner. And one day, Mr. Stevens would see the value in Malcolm's work, just not in the way he expected. As Malcolm walked out of the gallery, he made a silent vow to prove them all wrong. As Malcolm stepped out of the gallery, the bustling city streets seemed to blur around him. The harsh light of day didn't match the storm brewing in his chest. Humiliation gnawed at him, but it was nothing compared to the fire of determination that fueled his every step. His mind raced, he knew his art was special, but how could he make others see it? The rejection stung, but it wasn't the end. He wouldn't let Mr. Stevens define his worth. Unbeknownst to the gallery owner, however, Malcolm wasn't as obscure as he appeared. Far from it. Years ago, before he had ever thought of submitting his art to galleries, Malcolm's pieces had caught the eye of a billionaire art collector, Roland Matthews. Roland, a quiet and reclusive patron of the arts, had seen something in Malcolm's work that no one else had, the raw, untapped brilliance that spoke volumes without saying a word. Roland had bought several of Malcolm's most significant pieces under the radar. The artist, still working in anonymity, had no idea that his paintings were being carefully curated and stored in a private collection. He had simply been too focused on his craft, pouring his soul into each stroke, to pay attention to who was buying his work. Roland's influence in the art world was vast, and he had a network of high-end art dealers and auction houses who secretly moved Malcolm's paintings in and out of the most prestigious galleries. What Mr. Stevens didn't know was that Malcolm's abstract pieces had already been sold for millions at exclusive art auctions in Paris, New York, and London. They were prized by elite collectors, their value steadily increasing as the art world slowly recognized the genius behind the mysterious artist. Roland had strategically begun promoting Malcolm's work within the highest circles, keeping the artist's identity a secret, allowing the paintings to grow in value while ensuring that the market demand would skyrocket. Meanwhile, Malcolm's life remained relatively unchanged. He continued to work in his small studio, unaware of the immense worth his creations had acquired. To him, it was always about the art, not the money. He hadn't cared for the limelight or the accolades, his goal had always been to express his truths. But unbeknownst to him, the world was beginning to notice, and the demand for his pieces was only growing. Months after the disastrous gallery visit, Malcolm's name began to pop up in the whispers of the art world's elite. Collectors and critics alike were intrigued by the anonymous artist whose paintings seemed to capture something extraordinary. His work was no longer just something people admired, it had become a commodity, something that could command a fortune. Roland Matthews had been quietly working behind the scenes, orchestrating this rise in value. He had taken notice of the snub at Mr. Stevens' gallery and knew that the world wasn't ready for Malcolm to be recognized publicly just yet. For now, it was better for the artist to remain in the shadows, his pieces continuing to rise in value under the radar. But Roland had plans. He knew that it wouldn't be long before the world discovered Malcolm's identity, and when that day came, it would send shockwaves through the art world. It was only a matter of time before Malcolm's art would be recognized on the world stage, and those who had once dismissed him would regret their actions. Weeks passed, and life in Mr. Stevens' gallery continued without much excitement. The rejection of Malcolm's work had quickly faded from his mind as he focused on securing more established artists and expanding his client base. Sales were steady, and the gallery's reputation remained strong. The world of art was as predictable as ever, or so Mr. Stevens thought. One rainy afternoon, as he sat in his office flipping through invoices, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar name, but the voice on the other end was calm and confident, with a smooth tone that carried the weight of power. "Hello, Mr. Stevens. My name is Thomas Pierce. I'm an art collector, and I've heard about your gallery. I'm interested in acquiring some pieces for my private collection, and I'd like to discuss a few options with you." Mr. Stevens leaned back in his chair, surprised. He had never heard of Thomas Pierce before, and a quick glance at the name didn't ring any bells. But he was intrigued. He never turned away a potential buyer, especially one who seemed serious. "Of course, Mr. Pierce," Stevens replied. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "I'm particularly interested in abstract art," Pierce said, his voice growing more enthusiastic. "I've heard you carry some excellent pieces. Specifically, I'd love to see what you have in stock from the lesser-known artists. I want something that speaks to me, something unique." Mr. Stevens raised an eyebrow. "We do have a few abstract pieces. Some by more experimental artists, but they're quite niche and not really in high demand. I'm not sure if they'd be of interest to you." "I'm sure they will be," Pierce replied, his tone unwavering. "I'd like to arrange a private viewing. I'll be in town next week. Can you make the time?" "A private viewing?" Mr. Stevens hesitated for a moment but quickly regained his composure. Private viewings were always lucrative, and a buyer of this caliber might lead to a big sale. "Certainly," Stevens agreed. "Next Wednesday, 2 p.m. I'll prepare the works for you." The call ended, and Stevens sat back in his chair, puzzled. He was still unsure what kind of collector would be interested in such niche, experimental art, especially since these pieces didn't seem to fit the typical demands of his clientele. But the opportunity was too good to pass up. When Wednesday afternoon arrived, Stevens greeted Pierce in the gallery's front hall. The man who walked in was nothing like he had expected. Thomas Pierce wasn't the usual art enthusiast one would envision. He wasn't wearing the traditional high-end suit one might associate with elite collectors. Instead, he wore a simple yet tasteful jacket, jeans, and a scarf. There was an air of understated wealth about him, something that didn't scream fame or fortune. Stevens found this a bit odd, but he didn't let it show. "Mr. Stevens," Pierce said with a firm handshake. "I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to offer. I'm particularly interested in what's been overlooked in the past." Stevens led Pierce into the main gallery, where the experimental and abstract works were displayed. They passed over some of the traditional pieces and settled in front of a series of abstract paintings that had been mocked just weeks ago. Malcolm's work, paintings that Stevens had dismissed as being too untamed and wild. Pierce took his time, studying each piece closely. His eyes didn't wander, instead, he was engrossed in every brushstroke, every hue. Stevens stood silently beside him, awaiting his verdict. What was it about these pieces that had piqued his interest? Pierce finally spoke, his voice low but filled with genuine admiration. "These pieces are exceptional," he said, his words hitting Stevens like a shockwave. "The raw emotion, the way the colors speak to the viewer, it's exactly what I'm looking for." Stevens blinked, taken aback. You like these?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "But, they're not like the other works. They're unconventional." Pierce smiled. "That's exactly why I want them. They're real. They capture something deep and human. I don't want the predictable, I want something that challenges the viewer. These works are a treasure, and I want them in my collection." A knot tightened in Stevens' stomach. He couldn't believe it. These were the same paintings he had rejected just weeks ago. The pieces he had mocked, writing them off as insignificant. But here stood Thomas Pierce, a collector with an eye for what he now realized was art's true value. Pierce turned to Stevens, a look of calm confidence in his eyes. "I'll make you an offer for all of them. Name your price." Stevens, stunned, scrambled to hide his surprise. He tried to recover quickly. "Well, I'll need to check their provenance and verify the authenticity," he stammered, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. Pierce raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure you'll find everything in order," he said smoothly. "But I'm ready to make an offer now. You won't find another buyer like me." Stevens, still in shock, nodded. He'd never seen a buyer this serious. What he didn't know was that Pierce already knew something Stevens didn't. These pieces were not just worth something, they were worth millions. And as Stevens struggled to process the unexpected turn of events, he could feel the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. The pieces he had thought were insignificant were now at the center of a bidding war, and he, the dismissive gallery owner, was about to be outbid by the very works he had once mocked. The private viewing had been going smoothly until Thomas Pierce slowed his steps in front of the first of Malcolm's paintings. As he studied the piece, a swirl of vibrant red and deep blue that seemed to pulse with energy, his eyes widened slightly. He took a deep breath, almost as if to take in the full depth of the work before him. "This is it," Pierce murmured, his voice filled with awe. "This is exactly what I've been searching for." Stevens, still reeling from the shock of the offer and trying to compose himself, felt a strange unease settle in his chest. He watched Pierce's intense focus, but his mind was elsewhere. He had once been so certain about these pieces, dismissed them as unpolished and too chaotic to have any true value. And now, here was this millionaire, so absorbed in Malcolm's work, practically breathing in the energy of the canvases. Stevens cleared his throat, trying to recover from the unexpected turn of events. "Well, yes," he began, attempting to sound confident. "I remember when these were brought in. They didn't quite fit the current trends, you see. They were unconventional, and at the time, I didn't think there was much of a market for them. They were a bit too, bold, shall we say? And not really in demand." Pierce glanced at him, his face unreadable. He stepped closer to the painting, still staring intently at it, before turning back to Stevens. "That's exactly the point, Mr. Stevens," he said, his voice now more serious. "These pieces aren't just bold, they're groundbreaking. The art world has shifted, and what was once overlooked is now becoming the center of attention. Malcolm's work, in particular, is being recognized for its genius. People are starting to understand the true value of this style." Stevens froze. His throat tightened as the reality of Pierce's words began to settle in. He had been so certain that the abstract art, so different from what he typically sold, would never find a place in the high-end market. He had assumed it was just a passing phase, too raw, too unpolished, too wild. But now, here was Pierce, someone whose expertise in the art world was well known, telling him the opposite. But, they were dismissed, even by myself," Stevens stammered, his disbelief evident. I didn't think they'd sell at all. And certainly not at the prices you're suggesting." Pierce let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head as if he were explaining something obvious. "You're not the only one who didn't see the value. Many people in the industry overlooked Malcolm's work at first. But now, people are finally waking up to what it represents. It's authentic, it's raw, and it captures something that's been missing in the art world for too long. The demand for his pieces has only been rising." Stevens felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard rumors of rising interest in unorthodox art, of a shift toward more emotive and experimental works, but he never thought it would affect his gallery. He had dismissed Malcolm's work, and now, in front of him, a major buyer was practically begging for it. The realization hit him with the force of a slap. "Wait," Stevens said, now unable to hide his shock. "You mean to say, these pieces are worth millions?" Pierce nodded, his expression serious but calm. "Yes. At auction, they're already fetching 7 figures. And that's only the beginning. Malcolm's work has been hidden in plain sight for too long. The market is starting to catch up, but I've already acquired several pieces at a much higher price than what you're asking for here." Stevens blinked, his mind spinning. The paintings he had once dismissed, practically given away for a fraction of their true value, were now worth more than he could ever have imagined. He had been holding on to gold and hadn't even realized it. Worse, he had turned away the artist who could have made his gallery a fortune. Pierce, sensing Stevens' discomfort, gave him a knowing look. "You missed your chance, Mr. Stevens," he said quietly. "But that's not entirely your fault. The art world is slow to catch up. But I'm here now, and I'm willing to make you a fair offer." Stevens stood still, unable to speak for a moment. He wanted to argue, wanted to justify his decision to reject Malcolm's work, but the truth was undeniable. He had been too focused on conventional tastes, on what he thought the market wanted. He had dismissed art that didn't fit neatly into his vision, and now he was paying the price. As Pierce turned his gaze back to the paintings, Stevens couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. He had underestimated the very works that could have transformed his gallery into something much bigger. And, worse still, he had underestimated Malcolm, a man who had become one of the most sought-after artists in the world. The truth had been laid bare before him, he had been blind, and now it was too late to change the past. The gallery was silent, save for the soft shuffle of feet across the polished floor as Thomas Pierce continued to inspect Malcolm's paintings. Mr. Stevens stood nearby, still in shock, trying to process the enormity of what was unfolding before him. He had spent years building a reputation for knowing what was valuable in art, and now, it seemed that reputation was crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. What Stevens didn't know was that the buyer standing before him, Thomas Pierce, wasn't who he appeared to be. Beneath the guise of a wealthy art collector, in the well-tailored jacket and stylish scarf, was none other than Malcolm himself. It was a calculated move, one that had been months in the making. Malcolm had grown tired of the dismissive attitudes that he encountered time and time again in the art world. The rejection from galleries, the mockery of his work, he had seen enough. It was time to show the world, and Mr. Stevens in particular, just how out of touch they were with true talent. Under the alias of Thomas Pierce, Malcolm had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had made inquiries through his network, feigning interest in buying art, positioning himself as a mysterious buyer eager to acquire the works of a so-called undiscovered artist. He had even gone so far as to hire a stylist to help craft his new identity, one that would immediately signal wealth and sophistication. Malcolm's plan was clear: infiltrate the system, confront the gallery owner who had rejected him, and expose the hypocrisy of an art world that valued profit over authenticity. He had to make Mr. Stevens see the damage his dismissive behavior had caused, and prove that Malcolm's art was, in fact, worth far more than he could ever have imagined. Now, standing in front of Stevens, Malcolm watched as the gallery owner struggled to come to terms with the truth. The same paintings that Stevens had once mocked were now on the verge of making him millions, and it was clear that the weight of his mistake was beginning to sink in. For a moment, Malcolm felt a strange satisfaction, but it wasn't just about proving himself to Stevens. It was about showing the world that true art, no matter how unconventional, deserved to be seen. The time had come for the reveal. Malcolm stepped forward, his disguise now feeling heavier with every passing second. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension in the air, as Stevens fumbled for words. The gallery owner's eyes were fixed on the paintings, his mind clearly racing, but Malcolm knew that Stevens was still clinging to the idea that this was just another one of those lucky finds. "Mr. Stevens," Malcolm said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the emotions churning inside him. "I'm afraid I need to tell you something." Stevens turned, startled, as if waking from a trance. "What do you mean?" he asked, still struggling to keep his composure. I'm just trying to figure out the best way to handle this. These paintings, are they truly worth what you say they are?" Malcolm gave a small, knowing smile. "Oh, they're worth far more than you think. But that's not the reason I'm here today." Stevens furrowed his brow, his mind now running in different directions. "Then, what are you saying?" Malcolm let the silence linger for a moment before revealing the truth. "Mr. Stevens, the person you're speaking with, the buyer you're trying to impress, he's not really who he says he is. In fact, I'm the one you rejected months ago. I am Malcolm, the artist whose work you dismissed as unworthy." The words hit Stevens like a thunderclap. He froze, blinking rapidly as the realization sunk in. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Malcolm stood tall before him, no longer the quiet artist in shabby clothes who had been dismissed without a second thought. "You," Stevens stammered. "But, how?" "I've been watching you for weeks now," Malcolm continued, his tone even, though his heart pounded with every word. "I went undercover to expose the attitudes that plague this industry, the art world that values prestige over talent, appearance over authenticity. You mocked me, dismissed my work, and thought it wasn't worth anything. But the truth is, my art has already been sold for millions, and now the world is beginning to recognize it for what it truly is." Stevens staggered backward, the blood draining from his face. I never knew. I never knew it was you," he said, his voice faltering. Malcolm took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "You didn't bother to know. You made assumptions based on what you thought would sell, not on the true value of the art itself. I'm here to show you how damaging that attitude can be, and how it can cost you everything." For a moment, the gallery was deathly silent. Stevens stood there, trembling, realizing how completely he had underestimated the very artist he had rejected. His pride and his business had been built on the belief that he knew what the world wanted, and yet, he had failed to see what was right in front of him. "I didn't mean to. I didn't realize," Stevens began, but Malcolm cut him off. "You didn't have to. The truth was always there, right in front of you. But you didn't bother to look past your own biases." Malcolm took one final look at the paintings that had been so cruelly dismissed. Now, they stood as a testament to something much larger, the persistence of truth, the resilience of art, and the power of an artist who refused to give up on his vision. "Good luck with your gallery, Mr. Stevens," Malcolm said coolly, turning on his heel. "But don't expect to see me here again." And with that, he walked out of the gallery, leaving Stevens to confront the very revelation he had never seen coming. The tension in the room hung heavy as Malcolm stood before Mr. Stevens, the truth now out in the open. The gallery owner, whose face had turned ghostly pale, was speechless. His mouth moved, but no words came out. His mind was racing, unable to fully grasp the turn of events that had just unfolded before him. I can't believe this," Stevens muttered, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. "You're Malcolm?" His eyes darted from Malcolm's face to the paintings on the walls, as if searching for some sign that the world he knew had not just crumbled. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I didn't know it was you. I didn't know." Malcolm held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not here to listen to your excuses, Mr. Stevens. I'm here to show you the cost of your mistake. Stephen swallowed hard. He had prided himself on his ability to recognize talent, his sharp eye for what was worth selling, but this was a humbling revelation. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his position, that he failed to see the true worth of Malcolm's work. Now, he was faced with the undeniable fact that he had rejected a genius, a man whose art was not only highly sought after but now sold for millions. Malcolm took a deep breath, steadying himself as he delivered the final blow. You rejected me. You mocked my work. You didn't believe in me. But now, I'm the one buying up the galleries that turned me away. I'm building a new empire, one where artists like me are given the respect we deserve. Stephen's eyes widened in disbelief. You're buying galleries? Malcolm nodded, his voice cold but firm. Yes. I'm investing in the very institutions that once saw me as nothing more than a joke. And I'm taking my art to places that value it, places where it's seen for what it truly is. This is bigger than just art now. It's about changing the system. The weight of Malcolm's words hit Stevens like a freight train. The gallery owner, who had once been so full of confidence, now found himself on the wrong side of history. He had dismissed Malcolm's potential, and in doing so, he had inadvertently become a part of the very system that stifled new voices, new talent, and true creativity. Malcolm took another step forward, his eyes locking onto Stevens. You can't undo the past, Mr. Stevens. But you still have a chance to be part of the future. I'm offering you an opportunity to work with me, to be a part of the change I'm bringing to the art world. But there's one condition. Stevens blinked, unable to speak for a moment. What condition? Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. You have to acknowledge your mistake. You have to admit that you were wrong. Not just to me, but to the artists you've dismissed, to the talent you've overlooked. You've built your career on your ability to judge what's valuable, but you failed to see the truth in front of you. The art world is changing, and you need to change with it. Stephen stood frozen, processing the enormity of what Malcolm was offering. This was his chance, a chance to redeem himself, to be a part of something bigger than the narrow world he had known for so long. But it came with a price, his pride. To work with Malcolm, he would have to admit the error of his ways and face the reality of his own failure. Malcolm crossed his arms, watching Stevens closely. So, what will it be? Are you willing to admit your mistake, or will you continue to live in the shadow of your arrogance? For a long moment, Stevens said nothing. His mind swirled with conflicting thoughts, pride, shame, opportunity, fear. But in the end, he knew what had to be done. Slowly, he lowered his head, a deep sigh escaping his lips. I was wrong, he said, his voice soft but steady. I underestimated you. I underestimated your art. And I've made a terrible mistake. I apologize, Malcolm. I'm sorry. Malcolm nodded, a small but satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Good. That's all I needed to hear. For the first time in their interaction, Stephen saw a flicker of something new in Malcolm's eyes, a hint of respect. It was a rare and powerful thing, and it was clear that Malcolm wasn't just giving Stevens a second chance out of mercy. He was showing him the power of humility, the strength in acknowledging one's mistakes. Now, we can move forward, Malcolm said. But know this is your last chance. The art world is changing, and I'm at the forefront of that change. If you want to be a part of it, you need to prove that you understand what it truly means to support artists, to value their work, not just for its price tag, but for its soul. Stevens nodded again, this time with genuine understanding. He had learned a hard lesson, but one that would forever change his approach to art and the artists who created it. As Malcolm turned to leave, he offered one final piece of advice. Take this moment seriously, Mr. Stevens. The world is watching. And it will remember how you choose to respond. With those words, Malcolm exited the gallery, leaving Stevens alone to reflect on the humbling moment that had forever altered his path. The gallery owner, once so certain of his own vision, now found himself on the outside looking in, as a new era in the art world began to take shape, one where the truth of art, not the price, would determine its worth. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change for both Malcolm and Mr. Stevens. What began as a confrontation in a gallery had now evolved into an unlikely partnership. Malcolm had proven himself not only as a visionary artist but as someone who could transform the very system that had once rejected him. Mr. Stevens, for all his pride and expertise, had been humbled by the experience. He had realized the extent of his own bias and the damage done by overlooking artists based on superficial judgments. With a deep sense of regret, he had agreed to Malcolm's proposal, putting aside his ego and focusing instead on the opportunity for growth. Together, they began working to showcase Malcolm's art in prestigious exhibitions, pushing the boundaries of what was considered marketable. Stevens, once a staunch believer in following trends, now understood that art was not meant to be confined by market expectations. It was about the raw emotion it evoked, the story it told, and the truth it conveyed. And Malcolm's art was all of that, and more. The partnership proved fruitful. They began to exhibit Malcolm's work in high-end galleries, and the buzz surrounding his art only grew. Critics and collectors alike were stunned by the depth and power of his pieces. The auction prices soared, and suddenly, Malcolm's paintings were in demand by some of the most prestigious collectors in the world. But rather than getting lost in the chaos of his newfound success, Malcolm remained grounded in his mission, to help those like him, those who had been dismissed because of their background, style, or unconventional approach to art. With the money from his growing success, Malcolm opened his own gallery. It wasn't just any gallery, it was a place where young, overlooked artists could have the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their race, age, or artistic background. The gallery became a sanctuary for raw, unpolished art that challenged the traditional norms of the art world. It was a platform where talent, not trends, took center stage. Malcolm's gallery became a beacon of hope for artists who had been rejected or overlooked by the mainstream art world. It didn't matter if their work was abstract, chaotic, or imperfect. If it told a story, if it spoke truth, it had a place. The gallery became a symbol of empowerment, proving that art wasn't about conforming to a mold, it was about being true to oneself and letting creativity flow without fear of judgment. As the years went on, Malcolm's influence in the art world grew. His name became synonymous with change, a force that had altered the landscape of the industry. He had helped dismantle the barriers that had kept so many talented artists from having their voices heard. He had created opportunities for others who had once been told they weren't good enough, weren't worthy enough, or didn't fit the mold. And as for Mr. Stevens, he never forgot the lesson Malcolm had taught him. He became a trusted ally, helping to mentor younger artists and pushing for greater diversity and inclusion in the galleries he worked with. He understood now that art wasn't just about sales, it was about giving voices to those who had been silenced. One day, as he stood in the middle of Malcolm's bustling gallery, surrounded by young artists discussing their work, Stevens turned to Malcolm with a smile. "I never thought I'd be here," Stevens admitted, his voice full of respect. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this. But I'm grateful for the chance." Malcolm nodded, his gaze scanning the gallery with pride. "We're all part of something bigger now. The art world is changing, and I'm glad to have you by my side. Together, we're giving artists the chance they deserve." And so, the story of Malcolm's rise, from dismissed artist to art world revolutionary, became a story of transformation, not just for him, but for an entire generation of overlooked and underestimated creatives. The art world would never be the same, and Malcolm's legacy lived on in the artists he helped to rise, proving that no matter how hard the world tries to silence you, your voice, and your art, has the power to change everything.